agricultural methods began, that is where the Polynesian language began, and people began to tattoo their bodies, etc. From there, they moved as far east as Central East Polynesia, which is the island groups of the Marquesas, the Society Islands, and the Cook Islands. And they arrived there perhaps in the last centuries of the BC era. From there, they went as far north as Hawaii, as far east as Easter Island. Both of those places were settled by about 600 AD. And the last major landmass in the Pacific to be settled was Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the best dates that we have for arrival here range between 800 and 1000 AD. Why such a range of dates? Well, I think that answers the second question, how did they get here? Because I have an ulterior motive in coming here. And I guess in everybody's history books we have some key myths, if you like, that survive, and they tend to hang around no matter how much research has been done to refute them. Probably the biggest myth in our history books is the myth of the Great Fleet. And what this myth is it's a story designed by early European ethnographers who wanted to know when Māori had got here. And they'd talk to Bob down the road and they'd get a story about his ancestor coming 30 generations ago. And they'd talk to someone else down the road and he'd say, oh, that same ancestor came 27 generations ago. And they were getting very confused. So what this particular fellow did, Percy Smith, is that he collected a whole lot of these genealogies that people had, tracing themselves back to the original voyaging canoes that came to New Zealand. He found so many canoes that he ignored most of them, and he chose 7 of the most popular or commonly occurring vessels. And then for the first vessel, he collected these genealogies, and he had a whole lot of them, and what he did is he averaged the number of generations out back to that canoe. Okay, so if Bob said my ancestor came 25 years ago and his cousin up the road said 30, he averaged all those numbers out and he got 28 generations. He decided that canoe arrived 28 generations ago. He gave 25 years to each generation and he came up for a date for that canoe. He did that for the other 6 canoes, and then he averaged those dates out, and he decided, and he had a nice neat little history of the discovery of New Zealand. New Zealand was discovered in 1350 by a fleet of 7 canoes. That flies in the face of the archaeological evidence which talks of waves of migration here. And it flies in the face of the old tradition that talks of waves of migration here on single canoes, or perhaps 2 canoes at a time, but mainly single voyages. And that is nice, how you see suddenly the old traditions often marry very well with the Western science, because the old traditions talk about people coming here in single vessels over a long number of generations, and for a number of reasons tied to population explosions. So things like brothers scrapping over land, fighting over land, or people fighting over family members or children, or whatever happens when you get too many flatmates in a small house, if you like. And that is just in line with what the archaeological record tells us, which was that there was a population explosion in the islands at the time and there wasn't enough resources for everyone. So I guess I've kind of been back in the islands, and I'd just like to bring us into New Zealand and to talk a little bit about New Zealand. But before I do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about that last question, how did they get here? Because from the evidence we have a clear picture that, in fact, the Pacific, which is, shall we say, 5 parts land to 995 parts water, was discovered, that the most isolated islands in the whole of the world was discovered by remarkable science that was developed over the settlement of the Pacific. But it's been very hard for scholars to accept that. And indeed, there's another theory that still hangs around today and was very popular in the 1950s and onwards, and that's called the drift voyage theory. And that's the idea that these people, these so-called, and I excuse the word, but it was the term used at the time, these so-called primitive peoples, who could not write, etc., could not have writing. How could they navigate their way across this isolated realm without the compasses, the maps, the charts, and all of the other tools of their European navigating counterparts? And I guess that is perhaps why it's been so hard to accept. I'm thankful for that theory because it stimulated a renaissance in the study of Polynesian voyaging. And what it found is people began to attempt these voyages in the 70s, 80s and 90s. They went out into remote areas and they found some of the last people who were still fishermen in Micronesia, etc., who were still navigating their way across hundreds of kilometres to go fishing without maps. And they found that that knowledge was the same as the knowledge that was still being saved in the proverbs, in the songs, and in the narratives of Polynesian people, even though that the navigating had died out. And so now we have an abundance of evidence to show that these people were able to navigate their way over such long distances. So New Zealand, Aotearoa is the original name for New Zealand, and it's actually, it's a little bit of evidence for that navigation because clouds, a navigator could tell where there was land because they could see the types of clouds that sat above land. And a very large cumulus cloud would always sit over a large body of land. And so apparently when one of the very early navigators came here, his wife exclaimed, she saw the cloud and she said, it is a long white cloud, Aotearoa, long white cloud, and hence the original name for New Zealand. So there we go. Are there any questions at this point?
When you said there was a large population, too many people, did the Maori people intermarry, or did they have different, more wives to one man, or?
Okay, well, the peoples that resided in that Central East Polynesian region, in the Cook Islands, etc., in that area, they were, by that time, they were of East Polynesian culture, so they lived in tribal, in groups based on common descent, and polygamy was not universal, but it was a tool used to, by chiefly people in some cases, to boost their numbers, if you like. But you've got to remember that, I guess, any human population on such small islands eventually, over time, there's going to be some pressure on resources.
So the population explosion was in Fiji and some of those.
Yeah, it was
not here.
in Central East Polynesia, yes.
But not here.
No. Although, of course, that occurred in New Zealand later. We'll get to that. But, after East Polynesians arrived here, they must have been here perhaps, it wasn't until about 1500, 1600 that we start to see organised warfare begin. We start to see large numbers of fortifications. So people are having to start to protect their resources and protect their land. And so that's a good indicator that around about that time, the numbers were getting up there and people were starting to have to protect their land. So I guess,
how much of the Maori culture do you think is still present? I mean, these dancers obviously have learned it from their parents.
I'll endeavour to answer that question. It could take me some time. How much of the Māori culture is still present today? I guess to do that, I have to really talk about that whole period of contact between Māori and Europeans, because New Zealand was formally colonised by the British Crown in 1840 by way of a treaty. Are we aware of this treaty? Okay, and I can go into that in some detail, but I think I'll work backwards and I'll try and answer your question. In the last 165 years, Māori, the story of the colonisation of Māori, if you like, is one of a rapid colonisation, and it's one where the Indigenous people here never gave up their rights. But, in short, I guess, the process of colonisation by which, by 1900, the Māori had no sufficient land to sustain them has had a detrimental effect on Māori. And I guess the most obvious way in terms of keeping their culture is that by 1900 they had no land. World War II comes along, the government says, hey, we need people to work in the cities. Māori suddenly say, well, there's nothing to sustain you at home. And we see the largest, probably the largest wholesale urbanisation of Indigenous people in all our world's history. Māori moved into the cities in such a short time and in huge numbers. Okay, and if you can imagine what that does for a culture trying to keep their language, their home dialects, and their culture alive. Because let's say that in the 3 decades from just before World War II to about 1970, we probably see about a 60% shift in the Māori population into urban areas. And that had a huge impact on Māori trying to keep their culture alive. But in saying that, Māori, I believe, have always been quite flexible. The way their society is structured is quite flexible, and they've always been quite ingenious in actually being able to adapt to new situations. So what they did was that they brought the institution of the marae, which is, did they go to the marae?
No,
unfortunately
we didn't get any. No.
All right. The marae is a central meeting place, let's leave it at that. It's a collection of buildings that is the heart of any Māori community, okay? And in the home areas, it's the heart of the tribal community. Are you with me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? When they came to the cities, their tribal communities were broken up, so they brought that institution into the cities and they turned them into urban marae where any Māori could come together and perform the same ceremonies they did at home, the weddings, the funerals, etc., come together and be on a Māori platform as Māori. And because of that, and because of Māori struggles to keep their language, today we are seeing a real renaissance in those things. But at the same time, we have a long way to go. Okay? I guess if I can leave behind all of the obvious things about colonisation for now, about the things that happen in terms of land loss and things, and give you probably a good metaphor for Māori cultural revival, it would be the language. Okay? Obviously, when Europeans came, Māori was the language that was spoken. Missionaries learned Māori, they wrote it down, and by 1820 there was a great grammar of Māori written, okay, in collaboration with Māori. Māori became literate very quickly because they wanted to learn agriculture, they wanted to get hold the key to the knowledge of the European, and so they became literate very quickly. But by 1860, school policymakers were talking about the language as an obstacle in the path of civilization. So that by 1871, it was illegal for Māori to speak Māori in the schools. Instruction was to be in English only. And from that time, Māori were systematically beaten for speaking their mother tongue in the schools, in the playground at lunchtime, and the policy was to rid the Māori language from the homes as well, in order to Europeanise and bring Māori into European culture. That policy lasted into the 1900s, and the disdain for the Māori language has also even survived up until quite recent times in some areas. For instance, shall we say about 12 years ago when I did my university entrance exams, I was scaled down in my Māori examination 20%. And all of my peers, everybody else who did European languages was not scaled down. And that was quite common. Okay? So there were, in 1983, our first formal qualification, right, the only kind of formal qualification we have to get at school. In 1983, Māori had to have a 65% fail rate, and all other European languages had to have a 35% fail rate. So, I'm not trying to paint a really dark kind of picture, but what I'm trying to say is that there were real obstacles in the way of this language, although it was very reluctant to die. Just like, European languages after other peoples have come in. It takes a long time. But by about the 60s or 70s, Māori suddenly realised, hey, our language is dying off. Our native speakers, my grandparents' generation, they're dying and the languages are being passed down. So they snapped into action and they developed a remarkable way of keeping the language alive, and that was total immersion language nests for preschool children. So all preschoolers all preschoolers, but it was targeted at Māori, could go into an institution every day and just be in a Māori environment, Māori language environment. This was so successful because the grandparents who were native speakers were running the show, the mothers were working, their children were learning it, the mothers were learning it, it was coming back up the generation, going home to the fathers who were coming home from work. Today we have over 900 of those centres open in New Zealand, and that system has been taken to Wales, it has been transplanted to Hawaii, and recently we've had Native American groups coming and looking at taking it home. So the language, because of Māori tenacity, if you like, and innovation, has survived, and the culture has survived with it. The government wouldn't fund it, so Māori kept pushing. When they wouldn't listen, they took them to court.